Today, I'm joined by Dr. Thomas Davidoff, economist and associate professor with UBC Sauder School of Business, to discuss the effect of the pandemic on Vancouver's real estate market. Thank you so much for joining me, Doctor.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
First and foremost, I'd like to ask your opinion on the outlook for Vancouver's real estate market in the wake of the pandemic.
Well, so far, I think we've seen a big drop off in sales volume, the number of transactions, but it hasn't. There's been both fewer buyers for sure, but also fewer sellers. So usually the drives changes in prices is if you've got fewer buyers than sellers. Sellers need to cut their prices to make sales. And that just hasn't happened to the extent we might have thought it would,
Right.
Given the shutdown in the economy. And obviously some people really struggling, businesses closing. You'd think a lack of confidence, but I think that sellers as well. And so far prices are probably off somewhat, but I think certainly, you'd think in the 10% or less range, and it could have been a lot worse. What's going to happen going forward, I think entirely depends on how the economy proceeds. Now, we did have CMHC, which sets rules for high ratio mortgage lending this past week, clamp down. So on properties less than $1 million, some buyers, because of CMHC's conservative moves to limit how much people can borrow depending on their incomes, that could have a negative effect. I think if businesses remain a long time, it's going to be attractive to people to sell real estate, to get cash together. But if we're able to gradually reopen, I think it's certainly possible that we're going to make this through with less negative impact than we might have expected. But the CMHC moved in the last week, I'd say that's possibly as COVID so far in terms of price impact.
As you mentioned, a drastic drop in demand. Why haven't the prices dropped as drastically?
I think fewer people are selling. It's not a great time to sell. If you didn't want to sell your home in a pretty hot market in February, when you were able to have a normal open house and all of that, why would you think now when you don't? I think that's the issue. I think a lot of people have decided maybe this is a temporary slowdown. Sure, I have some need to move, but I'm not going to sell right now. That's my best guess. Also, of course, people aren't trading up, and every time somebody trades up houses, they put a house on the market.
Deferral of mortgages is going to expire soon. What will happen then? Will we see decrease in price, like a drastic decrease in prices then?
That's an excellent question. I don't know what will happen. I would imagine if the government is imposing a shutdown on people, they'd be inclined to continue to work with the lenders to encourage deferral. Money is cheap these days. You're not accruing interest at a very high rate with deferral. So I think probably the lenders would be happy to work with the government to avoid a situation with a lot of people defaulting on their loans. The banks are big. They all have a big stake in things continuing to go well. So I think almost all parties would prefer not to have people default on their loans, but rather extend and when they're able to pay off, pay down the accumulated debt then.
I also like to know your opinion regarding the effect of COVID on the market, that is the short term as well as the long term.
Yeah, as I say, so far, short term, I think the market was probably going to accelerate. It looked very strong going into the spring. So maybe COVID has led to a minor price decline when we would have had possibly a significant price increase. So I don't want to say there hasn't been any effect. But again, we haven't seen the big negative in price movement that one might have expected with a prolonged shutdown and people uneasy about the state of the economy. So far, not too bad. Maybe significantly worse than it would have been otherwise. But of course, that's hard to know. We just haven't seen the big price drops. The question for the long run is just how long this all lasts and how long people are without incomes. If that ends reasonably soon, I think we might be okay. If it goes on for another year, for example, then if there's no restaurants open, no gyms, people are able to go to offices. If that goes on for a year, it's hard for me to believe we wouldn't have significant downturns. But it really just depends on how the health stuff turns out, and that's beyond my expertise to know.
And also, we've had a huge exodus with COVID-19. How do you think that will affect everything? Meaning people haven't been immigrating to Canada, because usually we see 67,000 to 76,000 people immigrating to Canada, but with this happening, I'm sure they haven't immigrated and migrants left. So I'm thinking that would have an effect as well.
Yeah, I think the geopolitical situation is complicated. I don't know that COVID will have a long run impact. When schools start up in the fall, we won't have probably as many foreign students coming in, certainly to the rental market, probably the purchase market as well, and that will have a dampening effect. But exactly what will happen with schools in the fall and into the winter, I don't know. But yes, I think international migration, there's been a discussion of that. Obviously, it's an important factor in our housing market. Now, with Hong Kong, for example, that's an attenuating effect. And maybe some of that is COVID. Maybe China cracked down when they thought people weren't looking because of COVID.
Right.
Obviously, there's going to be some people in Hong Kong who, seeing a dramatic change, are now inclined to come back to Canada, because of course there's a lot of permanent residents of Canada who live in Hong Kong.
Right. So going forward, on balance, how do you think COVID-19 will shape our lives? Will it fundamentally change consumer behavior?
Well, one interesting question people have asked is, are people going to want condos? I was talking to some friends from New York the other night, and for the last 10, 20 years, nobody's wanted to be in the suburbs. Everybody's wanted to be in the action in New York. Exactly. And a friend of mine moved to Florida from the suburbs of New York and couldn't sell his house when things were healthy. But with the COVID pandemic, everybody in the city now wants to be where he was in the suburbs. So, you're seeing single family home demand grow because you've got, room to roam around, a backyard. You don't have to share an elevator with a bunch of people who might be sick. I think if this really scars people, if we have another year of shutdown where you're worried about how healthy or sick everybody around you is, I would think that might lead to a taste for more decentralized living.
Right.
And so townhome, duplex, not having to share an entry, whereas condo has been such a hot segment. That said, BC's been pretty healthy. We have a lot of people. Yaletown is big. There's a lot of people living in apartments, and we haven't had a bad health situation relative to a lot of other places.
Right.
So, if this thing ends with BC staying healthy relative to the rest of the world, maybe no such impact. And the other thing is commuting. Do you really want to live in the suburbs and have to pile onto a bus or a train rather than potentially biking or walking to work?
Right.
So I think the long run effects are complicated, and it'll be interesting to see how they evolve. You could see it go in a number of directions. But, the important direction, of course, is no direction. People have limited memories and attention, and it's quite possible 2-3 years from now, it's the last thing on anybody's mind.
Right, exactly. But seeing everyone working remotely, I think it could lead to urban sprawling, but as you said, we don't know where it's going to go.
Yeah, I agree. New York is particularly interesting. Vancouver, a lot of people drive from the suburbs.
Right.
I'm somewhat perhaps biased by a conversation I had with my friends from New York, because you don't want to drive into Manhattan. And so taking the train, how they're going to get up and running is complicated. I think Vancouver, driving from the suburbs, more plausible.
And also, speaking of downtown Vancouver, we've got lots of office space there.
Yes.
What do you think will happen to that? That's interesting to see where that goes.
Yeah, the office market was very strong. There's a lot of construction happening. And, that's a macro trend that's really above my pay grade, whether everybody's going to say, geez, working from home isn't too bad. Why spend a lot of money on a downtown office? We can have flex space, for meetings here and there. At UBC, we're working on teaching by remote. Maybe the technology develops. I think in-person meetings, with the internet, people thought, in-person was going to decline and nobody would need cities anymore. And the exact opposite has happened. When you have the ability to expand your networks electronically, the benefits of meeting in person seem to have grown. So, it's quite complicated. One hope I certainly have is that people do less air travel. It's very bad for the environment. You waste days and days to have a 15-minute meeting.
Right.
And hopefully people get away from that. But offices, that's a very good question. Mm-hmm. It sure looks like some of the more high-end tech companies are reevaluating the need for office space and making sort of permanent moves. And studies I've seen, which are not very many, are that people are pretty effective working from home. Sure, you've got the refrigerator and the kids to pay attention to, but you don't have the office drama.
Could be distracting.
Most importantly, you don't have to commute, which is a big waste of time.
Exactly. And last but not least, how do you think millennials will be able to afford a house, or do they have to continue renting or stay with a family member?
Some of the things we've talked about are going to matter in that way. I think, unless international migration is permanently shut down by this virus, which I seriously doubt, I think Vancouver as a place with good health and a stable government. If you look around the world, obviously there are many places with bad health and unstable governments. One of them lies directly to our south, which is fairly remarkable. People from all over the world looking for opportunity. Of course, the first thought was always the U.S. I think, maybe depending on what happens in November of this year, that could be impacted. Exactly. So I would say the events of the last few months probably put the stability and healthiness of a city like Vancouver in greater demand. And so owning a detached house with a reasonable commute in a place as well governed and healthy as Vancouver, I think that's going to be something for the rich. Can you have a condo or townhome or half duplex that's affordable on a decent salary? That's a very different matter. Right. In a world with low interest rates and high demand growth, I do think rental for a prolonged part of people's lives is likely to become more important, just because the down payment, saving a 10% down payment, if that's what's required, that's a lot of money. And, the value of real estate endures past our lives. And the more growth we have in rents and the lower our interest rates, the bigger the part of the value of the real estate that's past the end of our own lives. And that just makes ownership challenging. Right.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Davidoff. It was a pleasure, and thanks for taking the time.
Well, great questions, hard ones to answer, as you saw, but great stuff to think about. Thank you for doing this.
Wonderful. Have a wonderful day.